Ingole.
Oh,
And then
Ingole. Okay. All right.
Give me
All right.
2 minutes. I have very small role to play in this talk, in this discussion. Uh, Hello, everybody. This is a dialogy. Uh, and thank you so much for your time and your efforts in this fantastic discussion. And from August till today, we had a long break of not having dialogics because of some unavoidable reasons. But after that, we are back, and I am really interested in listening to all the speakers. But before that, there are few rules. Please be muted. Uh, and if you have any questions, you can direct to Suraj in chat box. And we are also live on YouTube. People who are not able to join on Zoom, they can watch earlier talks and this talk as well on YouTube, and also share among the people who are interested. So Suraj, thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Prashant. Prashant is the co-conspirator of Dialogics. Today is Dialogics 8th installment. And I am, as Prashant said, I would like to echo his sentiments because it's a conversation that we really would wanted to have early on. But this is, I guess, one of the prescient moments for us to really revisit some of this, especially when it comes to the second Varna within the caste order, the Kshatriyas, or known by various other names, but for the convenience sake, we'll keep it to Kshatriyas. Before I begin, I would like to share a video. Let me see if I can do that. Can I do that? Can I do that? Can I do that? No, I can't do that. I can't. Okay, it's here. Okay, right here. Can you guys see it?
Yeah.
हम राजपूतों में नॉन राजपूत से शादी नहीं होती। जो राजपूत है दूसरे राजपूत से ही शादी कर सकता है। हमारे यहाँ 2 से 3 पीढ़ियों तक देखा जाता है कि कहीं किसी के परिवार में कोई ऐसा तो नहीं है जो राजपूत ना हो, जिसके रिश्तेदार राजपूत ना हो। अगर ऐसा हो तो वो शादियाँ नहीं होती हैं, और ये रीत शुरू से ही चली आई है और हम लोग इसे आगे भी लेके जाएंगे। हम नहीं मानते इस बात में कि एक राजपूत किसी नॉन राजपूत से शादी कर सकता है। हम इसका सपोर्ट नहीं करते और आने वाली जनरेशन को यही सिखाएं। हम राजपूतों में नॉन राजपूत से शादी नहीं होती। जो
All right. I just wanted to start the conversation with something that is visual and that's quite viral in amidst us. And it's a very powerful kind of intervention to what we are going to probably discuss today. Before I begin this conversation, I have been always thinking about the hegemonic presence of how we revisit some of the conversations on caste, because caste has been undermined and manhandled by intellectual stream, but as well as socio-political spaces, more so when it comes to assertion of a certain caste community, especially when belonging on the lower order or the subaltern consciousness, it has always been pushed back upon them for playing the caste card or the victim card, while the same parameters are not applied for the people who belong to the dominant caste. Before, we had conversations with Brahmins as to how do we think about the caste within Brahmin community, but also the location of Brahmins within the caste order. We also invited Baniyas to talk about how their own livelihood or how Baniya ethic informs or misinforms our understanding. And today, what we also would like to do is try to go and hear from the people who were born into the caste, and they might perhaps tell us more through the insights of what it really means to be the other or the dominant other in this case. There are 3 important figures that come to my mind when I think about the Kshatriya as a Varna, and it's been complicated and there has a lot been debates about this, but 3 important figures who I think are quite honorable and respectable in their own right. One is Siddhartha Gautam Buddha, who eventually becomes the Buddha. The second is Ram. And the third is Guru Nanak. All the three who trace their origins to Kshatriya Varna have somehow really brought out a new spiritual ethic. They really challenged Brahminism in their own might, and of course created a new egalitarian followership amongst themselves. We have multiple stories, unfortunately, when it comes to Ram, where Ram is interpreted almost in 300 different versions, because Ram is just so attractive. And why only does one particular Ram become central to our consciousness? Why there is no a subaltern Ram who has a different story to talk when it comes to the peasants and the working class context? Also, as I was reading Chinese history, Confucius can also trace his lineage equivalent of a Kshatriya, because he belonged to one of the aristocratic classes. So what we have is we have a rich philosophical, spiritual legacy of this, if you will, clan or group or caste group. Yet, right now, what we see is a very limited as well as rabid, right-wing, emasculating masculine figure of what it means to be a Kshatriya, Rajput, Thakur, or so forth. There is always an aspiration for one to denounce the person who belongs to the lower by deploying your own characters of strength and valor. And stories have been created. Many of them have myths. They are apocryphal stories that have not cannot justifiably described as authentic histories, but yet it becomes part of the mainstream canon, and yet we don't know much of it. So what we'll do today is I am so delighted to have 4 excellent panelists who will perhaps talk through their experiences, but also self-interrogate this, because usually what we do is when we talk about a caste, it's always the story of the oppressed. What we would like to also do is to humanize the conversation. Let's also put lens on the person who is trying to work against or probably work through the caste within his or her location within the caste system. I have 4 speakers, and I will invite them to offer 10 minutes of introductory remarks, and then obviously we'll talk with each other. We'll invite questions from others, but this conversation really becomes pertinent after Hathras. How the Thakur pride and how the Thakur clan gathers together irrespective of denouncing I raised this point. I said I haven't seen any Thakur women who are outwardly declaring them as Thakur women and denouncing the rape or the act of the local villagers. And I think we really have to now start breaking those silences. First, I will introduce Khushi. Khushi is a doctoral candidate in international politics at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She's at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, CPOD, which is at the School of International Studies, which is New Delhi. Her research interests are wide-spanning, but in particular, she looks at diplomacy through the gender as well as feminist international relations, history, diplomatic history, as well as international history. Second, I would like to invite my dear friend Vineet, who I just missed by a few months as he came to Johannesburg and I was on my way departing. But just to compliment on Vineet's work, Vineet has really unearthed some of the important archives, especially within the United Nations active lobbying of Indian government when it comes to dealing with race vis-a-vis caste. And Vineet, that article that you published I have exploited it at so many venues that it is almost, it is almost on my tongue that I can relate to how vicious the Brahminic dominance operated, especially when it comes to dealing with international relations and diplomacy, something which we don't talk about, but we can definitely see with Nehru as a Brahmin and his sister Vijayalakshmi Pandit as another extension of a woman Brahmin, especially speaking through the genderized aspect, and then B.N. Rao, who then negotiates, tries to negotiate, of course. And so what we don't know is we have just a very pricky part of conversations that take place. So Vineet is not just that. Vineet is many things. He's currently at Leiden. He finished his PhD in 2014. Right now, he has had stints at UJ, University of Johannesburg, SOAS, as well as Ambedkar University in India. His phenomenal book, which I think is out South Africa, Race and Making of International Relations, Roman and Littlefield has published. He's also had another book, which is Postscripts on Independence, Foreign Policy Discourses in India and South Africa. I don't think such kind of interesting interventions, especially through a caste as well as a critical subaltern lens, I haven't seen in a long time. So these are some of the important works. And he's so young to publish so many books, so it's a envious space for many of us. We have Prashant Negi. Prashant Negi is assistant professor. He is at Jamia Millia at the Center for Dalit and Minority Studies, Dr. K.R. Narayanan Center. His interest is wide spanning, and you can see Prashant Negi's name when you look at much of the literature, especially co-edited anthologies and co-authored papers that he has done with the Dalit Institute, Dalit Studies Institute at New Delhi, Professor Thorat, and amazing kind of canvas. One of his book that he wrote with Professor Sukhdev Thorat is Reservation in Private Sector, Quest for Equal Opportunity and Growth. Now, when you read this, you must just wonder, like, Negi, what the hell do you have to do with reservation? Because you should be someone who is opposing reservation. It doesn't benefit you. And so I think this is the kind of conversation we would like to open. And last but not the least, our esteemed Professor Ram Rawat. Ram has two books. One is something that really changed the historiography of how do we interpret the North Indian, especially the UP base, through the Chamar, or what we call the Dalit angle through that head book. His book is entitled Reconsidering Untouchability, Chamar and Dalit History in North India, published by Indiana Press. And India also, you have Permanent Black, who has published 2011 and 2012 accordingly. That book received the American Institute of Indian Studies Joseph Elder Book Prize, as well as it had honorable mention in the Association of Asian Studies Bernard C. Cohen Prize. His latest work, which I am very happy, which is in co-edited anthology with Kshatriyas. I hope he is safe with his collaborator, the Dalit Studies, published by Duke Press, and brings an excellent collection. And actually, it's a very interesting cultural theoretical interpretation with stellar line of contributors. Do check out their work. And also he holds a senior fellowship position from American Institute of Indian Studies. He was recently Smuts Visiting Fellow at Cambridge, University of Cambridge, as well as the American Council of Learned Societies. I will breathe now. It was a Shankar Mahadevan rap. I will invite Khushi first, and then we will go accordingly.
Thank you, Suraj, for inviting me to this panel. And I must say I'm quite intimidated because with being in company of such great scholars. And as I, when we first spoke, and as I said, caste is not something that I study. And that's why I was also a little hesitant. And I shared this with Vineet that I'm also hesitant to talk about it because this is not something that I study. I feel underconfident about that. But of course, and also congratulations for your book. I think I'm too late in congratulating you on that because I've literally been recommending it to every person I've been meeting for the past 1 month, and I'm halfway through it. But yeah, you're right. It's a conversation which is much needed. So I think I would just go by like the 4 questions that you asked us, to as a pointer. So something like how and when did I come to terms with my caste? And the specific instances which made me realize my status as an upper caste person, as an upper caste woman. I think one thing which personally for me as someone, who's coming from an upper caste background, and I have these conversations often with my own friends from who are within academia, that one is my education in a public university. I think that is one thing which made me very conscious and aware about the oppressive nature of the caste system. Because more often than not, what happens is when you talk about caste, the language is around culture, the language is around traditions, the language is around a certain sense of pride with your identity, something which is defining you. Then my understanding of caste and how I want to look at it comes from an informed feminist ethic, because that is something which I understand. I understand the relationship between an oppressed and oppressor from the viewpoint of gender. And that is how it started. And you mentioned Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. My PhD is on Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. But I started looking at gender, and that is one identity which I associate most strongly with, and talking about women's rights, and in general about the oppression and patriarchy and all of that. And then gradually, as you're working, and that's what happened with my work also, as I'm working, and then I started asking myself that, okay, so if in terms of value, if principally I'm understanding this conception of power, then it has to be replicated in other spaces also. It cannot be restricted to gender. Again, of course, I think all of us who are speaking here are also fairly urban, cosmopolitan individuals. Your association with the global network also plays a role, because when you become a racial minority somewhere else, you start understanding oppression again in a different way. So the first time I stood in that immigration line in US, with being the only brown person stacking all her papers while everyone white is standing as if, they own the world, I was like, oh my God, what is this? This has never happened to me. I've never felt this conscious and seen ever in my life. Where I come from, realizing my caste identity, see, I come from a background where, and I'm from Rajasthan, and caste is like fairly predominant in Rajasthan. And I also went to a school which actually, was a fairly elite school based on a caste identity. The school was founded in 1943 for the daughters of Rajput noblemen. And there are these stories because it was founded by the Rajmata of Jaipur, and Rajasthan has a certain feudal sense to how the royalty operates, and the vocabulary often is around that. So for me, the idea of caste in that sense, in the sense of like a Rajput identity, the physical space for us, it was created the minute I went to a school, which had, with the school, the institution had a Rajput identity by the name of it, and taking great pride in it. What is interesting is that, because all these questions are interrelated, but, when you talk about the intercaste relations, okay, so, and now when I look back, my idea of caste also came up when, prior to 5th grade, I was, so I distinctly remember this, that some of my batchmates in another school, they refused to sit with me because I had brought meat in my lunchbox, or if I would bring eggs in my lunchbox. And they just refused to talk to me. I was mocked by the entire class, okay? And I was like fairly young, and I could just not make any sense of it. Why? Why I'm mentioning this is because I think, how do I explain it? How my conception, and I think that's where it's very important to understand the background, because, in where I come from, and that's also how we talk about, because, when we are entering into an academic space, we talk about oppression and oppressed, and, there's also a certain performativity to it. That's my personal belief, because I think our vocation is also such which requires this kind of high moral standing and performativity. So many a times in theory, you talk about this, but in practice, when it actually comes to breaking that status quo, you don't see it that often, and which has been a critique of academia also being Brahminical, right? For me, class played a very important role. The lack of abundance, and a certain precarity economically, which just didn't allow these conversations to enter my house in terms of us and them. And even if it ever entered, it actually entered in terms of Rajputs and Baniyas. It never entered in terms of Rajputs and Dalits. Which now I look back, I also realize like Dalit is not a word which is an everyday vocabulary word. It is a word which comes up when you are getting into the intellectual debates, or when it's a matter of news, or, any harsh atrocity which has happened. So in the sense of identity and the oppressive nature of it, there have been different junctions where, I've realized it. Then I've realized also, because again, with the whole feminist standpoint also, what is very important is that, and I think that is something that every upper caste feminist needs to do. And that's what happened with Hathras also. And I personally found it very infuriating, because I think there's a tendency sometimes to appropriate victimhood. but, as a woman. There's one solidarity of a woman, but this thing that let's talk as a woman. Let's not bring caste because it will divide us. Like not talking about those intersections, which actually distinguish us. The conception of yourself being the best foot soldier of the revolution is something which I myself find problematic, and I think it is something which every individual, especially when we're talking in terms of caste, one has to keep remind oneself that, and I've to consciously do that. I'm not absolving myself of it, but to remind yourself that solidarity is not benevolence. And it's very easy to fall into that trope of do-goodness, in that trope of, oh, look, like we are so good and we are so enlightened and all of that, without acknowledging that when you are, and it happened with me personally also. I remember really early on when I interacted with a few Dalit scholars and I just met them, and they reacted to something with someone, someone else had said, and it was a very strong reaction, and I couldn't understand that why would anyone react so strongly, and again, I couldn't understand. I was like, you are a feminist, I'm a feminist, there has to be a solidarity. What is this? How can how can a woman not understand about another woman? And then I sat down a few hours later, and I remember I was at an airport and I called up my best friend and I was like, listen, I'm not feeling right about it. And she was like, yeah, you better feel right about it. Everyone has a different experience over there and you need to understand that. The lack of that also comes from pedagogy. What you're taught as what is intellectual, what is the vocabulary of equal, what is the vocabulary of emancipation, because often I did my undergrad in Maharashtra, in Bombay, and unfortunately now then I look back, in political thought, I didn't read any Dalit scholar other than probably Ambedkar. And I didn't even read, I didn't read Jyotiba Phule, I didn't read Savitri Devi Phule, I just didn't read them. And they weren't a part of curriculum. So to be very honest, had I not come to JNU, my stance on caste would have been fairly performative, which is the easiest thing to do, to put out posts, to put out, to be the flag bearer, in that sense, but not talk about it within my own space. Because when you do that, I often see it with a lot of people. A lot of my friends tell me that, oh, we were never aware that caste is a thing. We never thought, caste is, why are we talking about caste? It's so primitive to talk about caste. And then you have to break it down. And it's a very delicate exercise if you want to build conversation and not let people shut you out. So yeah, that is that. I also remember once my uncle, I was really young, and that was the first time I heard about Ambedkar in my life. And I was like, this Enthu Cutlet, I went to him and I was like, oh, he was the man who wrote the constitution, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, oh, but he was a bad man. He was against Rajputs. And I lost it. Because I was like, what? No, my teacher says otherwise, you're wrong. But, the idea of that superiority, it's instilled so young. That you probably need institutions like JNU, which, or Jamia, or, these public spaces which rescue you from that. So that is one thing. Then you ask me about, emergence of Rajput politics vis-a-vis in light of Brahmin supremacy. Again, as I said, I don't think I'm the most educated one on this panel, and I can only speak from my own observation. See, you don't need to be a Brahmin to exhibit Brahminical supremacy, right? And when I say this, I'm saying this because in my position as an upper caste woman, I try to look at caste the way I would try to look at race. You don't need to be a white person to exhibit white supremacy. You can be aspirationally white, which is the easier thing to do. when you want to fit in. And again, there's several things about it. The trope of that model minority. I've recently started saying that brown people need to stop being comfort food for white consciousness, because that is, again, the easier thing to do. So when I look at it from that perspective, there's an aspect, like the element is the same, right? Like when we are also talking about the Brahminical supremacy and the Rajput supremacy, for me as a woman, really both of them are equally bad. And I honestly can't distinguish them beyond a point. Probably a Rajput supremacy definitely will be a lot more masculine, because, that whole narrative of Valor, is so strong in the history, the narrative of courage and pride and this and that. Whereas with the Brahminical supremacy, it's, the whole purity bit. But when I look at the end result of it, it's equally bad for me. if I'm a woman who is speaking my mind. Within my, again, when I say all of this, I'm saying this while I'm situated within the privileges of my caste. So it's not that I'm down low, and like the reason why I can say this is because I'm privileged. I'm a product of that entire ecosystem. When you say gender and intra-caste issues amongst Rajputs, it's the same thing, See, that's again one place I'm still negotiating that with myself. That's why I can't have like a very categorical answer for it. But I just feel as a woman, you are negotiating too many things altogether. As an upper caste woman, of course, you're more privileged. But there's no equating at all. But if you would tell me that caste does not exist, patriarchy does not exist amongst Dalits, I won't buy that. So the space for negotiation as a woman is also changing, add to that economic dependence, that further complicates your space to speak up, and to probably like find that, I won't even say strength, because that's a ridiculous argument, to be very honest, and that'll be trivializing my own privilege. But to find that navigation, that ability to navigate, because there are too many tangents on which you're struggling. Yeah. And then how do you visualize Kshatriya future, in the anti-caste framework? I think it's a constant process of learning and unlearning. And if people like us who are sitting here, we don't talk about, within our own circles, if we don't acknowledge our own privilege, if we are not willing to cede space, most important. If I'm learning Dalit history and then I don't even get one Dalit scholar on board to be a first author and say, I'll be the second author, you be the first author, then I think my job will be fairly performative, because I'm using that to gain certain acceptance through a certain performativity. That's all the thought I have, to be very honest.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Khushi. We'll come back to some of these thoughts that will marinate towards as we hear more. I was waiting for your presentation so I could name drop Meera, who's again remains revered only in certain circles, and I think that's the kind of question we would like to revisit. Can Meera, who refuses the Rajput patriarchy as well as control of women's sexuality, and no less goes and becomes devotee of a untouchable, never seen, but one of the things is, can Meera become an inspiration for Rajput women? And that's the kind of question we will keep up for the conversation. Now I invite Vineet to take the floor and offer his comments.
Thank you very much, Suraj. Thank you first for inviting me, and it's kind of hard to follow, after Khushi is very articulate, how Khushi was very articulate in expressing views. I'm not really a scholar who's worked on caste that much. So these are going to be very personal reflections. The good thing is that, Prashant Negi is going to sort of follow me. And we come from the same place. So he'll be able to place all of it in probably more academic context. But I do want to start first by acknowledging, Suraj, your work, because, Khushi and I come from a field where you don't even mention caste. But because of the sheer force of your work and some of the other work that's coming up, caste was something that we've always studied in sociology and maybe political science, but not IR. But kind of now, when I look at some of the, for instance, documents, and you see the caste is everywhere, it's kind of baffles me that how early I've never looked at it. So just sort of, I just finished a book. It's a biography of V.S. Srinivas Shastri. And I start there with an anecdote when he goes to Canada and how he's received in Canada, blah, blah, and all of that, how he's this liberal and he's positioned against Gandhi. So I'd written the whole book and I started the book and I was revisiting the book after about a year, 2 years, when I'm editing it and sending it to the publisher. And I read the newspaper piece again, which mentioned him arriving in Canada. And the title was, V.S. Srinivas Shastri, the foremost Brahmin in India, arrives. And in the explanation, it was that, there are lots of people criticizing Shastri, but he's a Brahmin. That's a one-word answer to all his critics. Now, the thing is, I had read the same thing 2 years ago, but the Brahmin element and this whole idea that he's a Brahmin comes from he's intellectually superior to every other Indian. So, you don't need to question, you don't need to consider him the coolie, right, who come from lower caste and all of that. But when I read it 2 years ago, that was not what I looked at. I was looking at his comparison with Gandhi. But now, because you read so much of caste scholarship, that's your own work, and you kind of forced to sort of look at things which earlier you would not. And that's also caste privilege, right? Because you don't see caste unless you're kind of forced to do, and that's sort of upper caste privilege, like you started the whole thing that, it's only when Dalits do caste politics that it's caste politics, while in upper caste do it's politics. So speaking from the position of privilege, actually, I had never really thought about myself as being a Rajput until you asked me. And then as I started looking at the politics of my own state, I didn't realize that Himachal actually had 37% Rajputs, which is sort of the highest in terms of caste. And we've had, I think, 5 out of 6 chief ministers have been Rajputs, Thakurs, and just one who's from Kangra, Shanta Kumar, has been Brahmin. So there's clearly sort of a very dominance of Rajputs, at least in the politics in the state. Now, I was born in a village. I think Prashant Negi might know that it's a village which is it's called the Brahmin Village. It's called Nirman. It's a large village. It's got sort of deep history. It's very ancient in that way, but also it's one of the biggest villages in Himachal. But it's kind of called as Choti Kashi. It's kind of known as Brahmin Village because Brahmins used to be the main it's used to be primarily Brahmins, but actually half the population is of Dalits. So they don't even acknowledge in the history of the village. So we came, or my parents came from outside, and so there are these Thakurs who sort of come from outside, but there are also Vaishyas who come from elsewhere, and everybody gets their own mohalla. So there's a mohalla for the Vaishyas. There's a whole bit, the center of the village, the former center of the village was Brahmins, and towards the south, there's a big mohalla for Dalits where half of the village actually lives. And you see kind of in the topography of the village, it's also in terms of, because it's on the hill, Brahmins kind of live on the top part of the village. And as you go down, Dalits actually live at the bottom of the village. So it's also kind of, you see it in the geography of the village as well. But nevertheless, so we kind of are immigrants to the village. And while growing up, you heard these stories about purity of the village, that this was a very pure village. But when these outsiders came, the village that, it was desecrated. There was a plague apparently sometime in the village, and that was blamed on people who come from outside because, they brought in impurity and all of that. So you kind of grew up hearing these stories. There was certain kind, you knew that there's a certain difference from the Brahmins, but it was not a difference of privilege. It was always that, okay, we are kind of others of Brahmins because we come from outside. But apart from that, there wasn't much difference in terms of the politics of the village and so on and so forth. But yes, you always were aware that there are Dalits who you can't mingle with, you can't go to their houses, and so on and so forth. But there were also several things, and it's in Himachal, everything is in a way related to the deity, local deities, because that's probably the most important way in which caste is sort of difference is maintained. The fear of the local deity and so on and so forth. So you see, and Prashant sir will probably explain it better. So even for instance, the headscarf that women wear. I wasn't aware of it until I was reading a book in MPhil. Dalit women have to wear it differently from upper caste women, and that's actually how you figure out who is Dalit, who is not. Your cap, Himachali cap. The way you wear it, the color you wear it. That's how you figure out who is of what caste. And I didn't realize it because upper caste, I never had to think about these things. In the village itself, it's interesting you mentioned. Ram. Actually, the first time I realized that there is a difference in terms of caste is, Dalits were not allowed into temples. You never saw we had friends who were Dalits, but they never went into, and this village had several temples. And there's a temple for Ambika, there's a goddess. There's actually a temple for Parshuram, which is quite interesting. Parshuram is a Brahmin and known for killing the Kshatriyas and all of that. That kind of tells you the dynamics. But in the Dalit part of the village, there was a temple to Lord Vishnu. Now that's interesting. One, because you never find temple to Vishnus. You'll find temple to temples to Ram, Krishna, to the various avatars of Vishnu. But you never really find a temple of Lord Vishnu. And I don't know why there was a temple to Lord Vishnu. And Vishnu is also a very, upper caste god, if you think about it. But somehow that was the temple, and upper caste people would never go to that temple, and the Dalits could only go to that temple. So in sort of the caste system is quite in the air. It's everywhere if you look for it. It's in every step that you take. But also it's because it's so normalized, you never see it. Right, so that's how it was. And then I also studied, initially in an RSS school. There's Saraswati Vidya Mandir, which kind of is an interesting setup because actually that's where you first made aware that caste system is bad. But it's it's what you call what, as Suraj in South Africa would be called petty apartheid. The daily humiliations that you don't touch this, you don't touch this. Only those aspects of caste system is supposed to be bad. So, you would eat with, you would have friends who are Dalits, you would eat together with them. But once you've settled that, then it was assumed that the caste system is over and all Hindus would come together and make a Hindu Rashtra and all of that, and then direct their ire against the Muslims. So in a way, and that's kind of, I think throughout my education, that's what has happened, that, the petty apartheid aspects, and there's nothing petty about daily humiliations. That's kind of always been considered bad. But the other side of it, things like and then you believe that because you do not practice that, then everything else like reservations and all of that also kind of becomes bad. Then you believe that they are equal now, and therefore, reservations should not be there. And that's kind of Kangna Ranaut kind of territory you're getting into there, right? Where you believe that, because, you can drink water from someone's hand, everyone is equal now, everyone has equal opportunity, so, merit should stand. And that was kind of my point of view until, I went to military school afterwards, same ideas. That was my point of view quite until JNU actually, because, in JNU, then you start figuring out the nuances. So that's kind of how I've personally sort of, my own development in terms of thinking about caste, that it was always that the petty apartheid, that your daily humiliations and that sort of stuff was bad, but but merit, of course, then everyone is equal. And like I said, and again, Prashant would probably talk more on that in terms of the local politics. Both of us come from Upper Shimla or Upper Himachal, which is called the Old Himachal, and which is still, it's very feudal. I mean, our chief minister 6 times was Veerbhadra Singh, who's a former sort of king. So it's a very feudal setup, and because of which caste system is very prevalent. It's kind of notions of purity, and all of that. It's quite medieval in that sense, and that also reflects in the politics. Who you vote for, and that sort of stuff, and which is the reason, like I said, Thakurs have been sort of, or the major sort of population group in the state, but also have been voted for. It kind of breaks down a bit if you go to what is called the New Himachal, because the OBCs in some ways have gained certain power there. And so the politics of that part is different, but our side of Himachal is quite dominated by the Thakurs. Yeah, so that would be my initial remarks.
Thank you so much, Vineet, and appreciate your new strides and intervention in the international studies, diplomacy field. As we continue to build up, there's some kind of questions before I, one of the things, Parshuram's story is quite infamous, or rather famous. And, if Parshuram's story was told to me, I'll be pissed. If he would have slayed my 21 generations, that's what they say. So one of the question is, how do Rajputs sit well or comfortably with that narrative? And also the narrative that follows is because the males were killed, the Rajput woman had to then go and procreate with the Brahmin, and so whatever was created. So that's the kind of a very distinct history to that. And so we will visit to that part. Now I invite Prashant Negi to offer his comments.
Thank you, Suraj, for having me here. And it's been a pleasure to listen to both Khushi and Vineet. And I'm here to take many things and learn and unlearn from this discussion. So I've had, while I was listening to the conversation of the panelists here, one thing that I started thinking about was situating myself in the whole discourse and debate that we are having here today. And another was that my own research, which I've been undertaking for the past 10 years now, on my own people, the Negi community, and my region, which is one of the 12 districts of Himachal Pradesh, known as Kinnaur. So I'll begin by contextualizing my own self in this whole discourse. I was born into a fairly influential family. My father was in the Indian Administrative Services. And I'm also of a mixed parentage. My mother is from a different area. She belongs to the royal family of Sirmaur. My great grandfather was the Wazir of one of the erstwhile chieftain states, Rampur Bushehr. So all these appendages, as I would call him, I became aware of them only recently, in terms of when we started thinking about caste, or like when my family started situating themselves at a particular location in our society and generally. But otherwise, if I look back at my life, there was a secularization and democratization of traditions right from the childhood. So thinking on caste or thinking about equity among human beings, or thinking about humans as humans, began very early, all thanks to my father, who was a liberal and a progressive in that way. So and also because I was born and in Simla, and Simla has these rich colonial schools, Catholic schools. So my first foray into education was in a Catholic school, where we were taught about equality of mankind, and we sang Bible hymns. And thereupon I went and studied in Delhi, where surprisingly we sang the hymns by Meera. And so it was more like from a sort of a Catholic tradition, we were more Hinduized. From there, again, I went into St. Stephen's, and there, again, we were, discussing or talking about issues, religion was a big part of our assembly every day. And from there, one finds himself into a place where both Khushi and Vineet are from, JNU, and where you have this, complete new thinking about various things. And thereupon, I went and taught in a girls' college in Simla, and it was more like you get exposed or to feminism and women, and and then I had the privilege of working in the Dalit studies, and from there in Jamia Millia Islamia, where which has a large proportion of students from the Muslim community. So I think I've had a fairly grounded kind of or overall kind of a experience, and I was exposed to thinking or reading about caste at early age. Also, contextualizing caste, as Vineet was pointing out, in day-to-day matters related to conversations or interactions or hierarchies, or how people are situated in a particular society, comes to us very early in our life, because most of the relations are based on caste. And so taking it from there, I started working on my community almost 5 to 10 years ago now. And so during the course of that research, I unlearned a lot of things. So first of all, when you introduced me as a upper caste Rajput, that is, I would situate that only as constitutional and an official. Where I come from, the entire district is classified as a scheduled tribe district. So whether you are a Brahmin or you are a Rajput, one is classified as a scheduled tribe, and that classification is based on the relative isolation of that particular district from the rest of the India. But the classification as such was done fairly early. And if we see the socioeconomic condition of that particular district right now, it would probably have a per capita income which is the highest in the country. And with most people having apple orchards, tourism being rampant in the area, and many other opportunities in terms of cash crops and other diversifications in terms of hydropower, etc. So one is the classification, how people view you, and one is how you situate yourself, and one is the official side of things, how we are demarcated as a category and as people. So in Kinnaur, surprisingly, people have, the caste system operates in Kinnaur only within 2 varnas. So we either have Rajputs who are in the vernacular parlance known as the Khoshia or the Khosh, and the scheduled caste community, which is known as the Domang and the Chamang, based on the occupations that they profess. And so it provides an instance of a fascinating sociological study wherein the area is demarcated as tribal, but there's extensive presence of caste. And despite the presence of caste and despite it being recognized or enumerated in the census of India, the region continues to be demarcated as scheduled tribe. And caste then there functions between two varnas, which again provides us as an instance of challenging the dominant models of caste, either if you see based on the Kigley model or the Brahminical model or the Varna model. So caste, it seems, is an extremely adaptive organization and a structure wherein it does not seem to operate within a pan-Indian classification. And there are local and regional specificities of caste which need to be contextualized and understood. So one is that, if you talk in contemporary times, there is a huge revolution going on in terms of access to information. Everybody has access to internet and mobile phones, and people are accessing information, and development is at a different level altogether. So these processes have ushered in a massive sociological changes within the Himachali society. And while the Himachali society is changing, at the same time, it continues to hold on assiduously to its old traditions. Like Vineet pointed out, what I saw through my research was that the process of castification or the process of Hinduization is also a byproduct of how democratic India expanded itself, or how there was a secularization of institutions in various areas. If you go back to the history of Himachal Pradesh, there have been some authors who have written that actually the Rajput community was completely absent in the region. And we actually did not even have the dominant, the Rajas or the royalty. And we had petty chieftains and we had petty states, and they were always at war with one another. But like it happens with an expansion of any belief, it was considered that people need a leader, and that leader needs to come from somewhere. So, like, if you see the names of the dominant dynasties in Himachal Pradesh, they have these surnames as Sen and Pal. So the Sens and the Pal are not castes which are local to the region. So they have come from elsewhere, sort of juxtaposed from somewhere and brought and then contextualized into the political and social relations of the state. And sometimes their position or their position in the hierarchy was also dominated by the fact that they were contextualized into religion by saying that the divine has this much percentage of Vishnu in their whole body. So, like, it was the royal was the divine ruling on earth. And so methodological inquiries into caste, like, have more or less vacillated, but they tried to present a sort of a model which was like, pan-Indian. And this research basically tries to question that. And Professor Rawat's work is also fascinating in that regard, because it continues to change the paradigm in the way we are thinking on caste. And so one interesting thing that I would like to speak about is, like, that one situates himself or herself in the hierarchy on the basis of caste. But what my research found that, that there are other denominators of caste which operate in regional terms. When I was doing my research, like I said, I'm from a mixed parentage. So because of me being from a mixed parentage, I don't speak the language of my father's village. And since I was educated outside, I usually used to come back to my home in Simla, and I never had much opportunities to go back to my village. And because of that, when I went and did my research, I was talking to one old lady who was around 75 years old. And when I was asking her some questions, she she immediately sensed that I was not, I did not belong to the region merely because I did not speak that language, and he started speaking to me in the local language. So she asked me, how do you do in a local language? I knew the response to that. So I responded in colloquial vernacular language, but then she said something and I could not even understand or respond to what she was saying. So she immediately told me that you are a pocha. The word pocha in our language means an outsider, which is generally used for anybody who is not a Negi. So she immediately marked me as an outsider. And then when I was thinking about it, so I knew that, that the denominators of hierarchy are not just ascribed. So like on ascription, like, by my identity is at that of a Negi and I belong to that community. But because I do not speak the language, I am demarcated as an outsider. But later on, I found out that, that even residence plays a big role in your identity. So if you do not live in a particular area and you do not speak that particular language, then you are considered differently, even if you might be of that particular caste. One thing was that, then during the course of the research, I found out that the cognomen Negi basically, it is, it means, it was a title and it was not a surname as we use it now. And that surname, that title was given for any civil or military acclaim. And later on, somehow, like, with the process of castification, etc., everybody started using the cognomen Negi. And now we have this whole process of people being, people using their family names after Negi. Like, at one point of time, my family name is Bhisht. So I would use Prashant Bhisht to be different from the others, or like, from the scheduled castes. But then, because my grandfather got this title of Negi, so like, to be different again, he started appending Negi after his name. And now we have this entire process of like people naming themselves as Prashant Negi Bhisht. So again, because it was a marker of standardization. So now again, people want to be different. So they want to use that cognomen again. And we also see this whole process of like, people reflecting their caste even on their vehicles. So like when you go to any place, like even in Delhi, we see this whole thing of like, on the windscreen, people have written Brahmin, Rajput, Jat. And similar things are visible in a small place like Kinnaur as well, where people are appending their family names on their vehicles to show their identity. So hierarchy, is structured by these. I mean, like, it would take a day to go into the whole research, but I would also like to hear what Professor Rawat has to say. And so I would just end by saying that, that though there is, in Himachal, caste is prevalent. It structures the whole social, cultural, political relations. But at the same time, we also see that there is mobilization among the Dalit communities. Like I saw that the Dalit communities are now no longer wanting to be part of the whole DT discourse. And earlier they were not. They were just they are called as Gajantri Bajantris, or like, they are the ones who are the musicians. So they are moving in front of the DT, and they are playing music as if to tell people that the DT is coming, and also to ward off any pollution that the DT might take in. So now they are refusing to do that particular duty. And another thing that I saw was that the Dalit community is propping up its own DTs. And so there is mobilization amongst the Dalit community in terms of education, in terms of their economic status, and they're realizing that, that they're a political capital as far as the vote bank is concerned. Vineet was talking about the the hamlets being situated uphill and the Dalit hamlets being situated and the periphery of the villages. But very interestingly, what we have found is, like, in the hills, the road plays a very important role in demarcating your economic status, like, how close you are to the road. And when you're next to the road, like, you can build shops there, or you can have buildings there, etc. So interestingly, like, call it divine intervention, the roads reached the Dalit hamlets first. And their fortunes changed overnight because their properties were right on the road. So these factors are contributing to the manner in which power is being negotiated in our state and how caste is being understood or reimagined. So I would like to just end here, and thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much. I think, once we have a Q&A round where we can be more candid about it. Thank you. And now, of course, let me invite Ram Rawat. There are so many questions on table already, but, one of the things is, the kind of Ram taking his position and being a stellar scholar in his own right is quite a distinct, but we don't see as many of Rawats intellectualizing this. So I'm happy to hear. Rawat, over to you.
Thank you, Suraj. Thank you for organizing this and inviting me. And I also want to thank you everybody who's listening and watching this from different parts of the world. And I want to thank them for their patience in this process. And I'll try to keep my presentation short. So a couple of things. Let me start with a couple of things I've heard here. One is, Suraj, I'm quite tickled by the fact that 3 Thakurs you found, Kshatriyas, are all from the hills. which is actually quite interesting, because when we think of Thakurs, we think of Gangetic Valley. And my experience of Thakur in Delhi, growing up in Delhi and in universities there is, from people from Bihar, UP, and sometimes Madhya Pradesh. So it's quite I might come back to it, but it's quite interesting. And the second thing I want to say here is, I think 2 or 3 things, and this is also in response to the way you started, Suraj, is I think we may want to rethink the question of caste, not in relationship to marriage, but in relationship to privilege. If you look at what Prashant and Vineet and Khushi and what I'm going to talk about is how caste is a question of privilege and access to that privilege. And I think marriage is a more visible form of that privilege that we see in the media. And I want to start with that point also, the privilege, because when I grew up, I was growing up in Delhi, in RK-Puram colony and Lodi colony. My father was a clerk, so he was a small-time, low-level office Indian employee of the Ministry of Home Affairs. And so I went to local schools, and so my experience in Delhi, in that small government colonies, as they're still called, and my experience of caste was more through the medium of privilege, that people live, mediated through also the fact that people worked in the government offices and we can go to local schools. And so caste was absent except in the context of family discussions over marriage. And which is, or sometimes we'll study about it in the school. So the caste, as both Vineet and Prashant have narrated in great deal, I encountered more explicitly when I used to go to my village. I'll give you 2 examples here, which echoes what Vineet and Prashant have told. So when my first memory of going to my village when I was probably 12 or 11, 12 years old, the memory about caste, is there were two public baths in our village. One was for the village elite, and the other was for the Dalits. And the one for the Dalits was actually empty. So I ended up going and taking a shower there, and my uncle saw me and shouted and asked me to come out. This is not the place for you to take a bath. And so I must say here, in the late 70s and early 80s, there was some we can call quote unquote Congress or Nehru progressiveness of the age, which has actually disappeared now. So we might want to recoup that progressiveness of the 70s and 80s that has dissipated completely now, erased. So we said, I actually fought with my uncle, my chacha, and I said, no, that's fine. We need to break this boundary. So I ended up taking a shower, and he ignored me. And after I insisted, because my father was the oldest, so he probably decided to let me deal with it. And so I ended up doing that. And the second time, of course, when I went to one of my chacha's wedding, the band players, as both Vineet and Prashant have mentioned, came from that background. So those are the contexts in which you actually personally see and realize that actually there are two different worlds. In Lodi colony, caste was absent. It was absent because I think it's a question of privilege. It's not because we didn't encounter in the way in which you'd encounter in the village, because there it's everyday encounter. And the third thing I would say here, building on what Vineet and so growing up in a small, in a government colony, the other identity, I think the identity I grew up with in Delhi, that I was actually a Pahari. I was a Pahari. I was never a Kshatriya or a Thakur. I was a Pahari. I was a marginal person from the hill. So I don't know whether Vineet encountered this or Prashant, but I was always called Pahari by my friends in schools.
Yes.
And by my friends in colleges, and of course, people from Bihar and UP will always say, oh, you're a Pahari. And that was Pahari is a dominant discourse in the plains of northern India. And that was my kind of formulative identity, that I'm a Pahari. It was only when I'm in my village or in my family setting that I will recognize that I'm also, so the word Pahari captures two or three things in Delhi. One is that you come from Pahari community because their families are obviously uneducated or have lesser access to education, or your parents work in low-level jobs, and the third is that you are marginal, you are from the hills. So that was the kind of the identity that that was how I was called by my friends, in both in schools and also in colleges. I don't think it was a dominant one, but that always echoed. And if you read Hindi literature, you will see that the notion of Pahari is very prominent. But anyway, I don't want to say much about that. The third thing I'll say here, and I want to start this with your conversation about caste, is I came to the study of Dalit studies by two things. One, I think the question of caste was fundamentally shaped by the violence that followed Mandal Commission. I was formed by the discourse around Mandal Commission in 1989, 1990, 1991. Mandal Commission was something far more profoundly significant in shaping the discussion on caste than anything else in the late 20th century. And so that's one. And the second thing, my entry into this process of Dalit studies takes place because I used to go with a friend who was studying, doing ethnography when I was doing my MA. I was working with a friend who was studying in Chicago, and I used to go with him to the Balmiki or Bhangi colony in Delhi. And so I was figuring out my research topic, and so we went. I used to go with my friend, and you might know him, Vijay Prashad. And so he was studying the question of caste from the point of view of Bhangi in the Bhangi colony. And in the Bhangi colony, when I will tell people that I'm doing research and I want to do research on Indian history, the three questions that I was asked by a couple of Dalit activists that actually shaped and have continued to shape my intellectual journey. One was, when I said to him that I'm studying history, they said, oh, the history of the upper caste, the history of the caste Hindus, the history of the upper caste. You study that, don't say that you're studying Indian history, say you're studying history of caste Hindus. And I think that was a very good way of putting it. And because I asked him why, and he said because in your history, and these were his words, in your history, Dalits and Ambedkar are absent. You don't teach about us. So that was the thing that he said to me, and I think that is true. People who studied in JNU, Delhi University, know that we didn't study Ambedkar or even Dalit histories. We study the question of Dalit purely from the point of view of reform question. The study of Dalit was purely a social reform issue. So it was not an intellectual or political question. It was always a social reform issue that they want. So that was one. And the second thing he said, when you want to study untouchability, you come to Dalit neighborhoods. But we did not do anything to create this untouchability. Why do anthropologists from JNU, Jamia Millia Islamia or Delhi School of Sociology come to Dalit neighborhoods? If they want to study Dalit untouchability, they should go to, Greater Kailash, Defense Colony, Sarojini Nagar. Those are the colonies he named. And I think that to me was a profoundly, and he said, we don't like that people every year, people from sociology departments will come to do a survey in our neighborhood. They never do this kind of survey in Sarojini Nagar colony or other colonies. So, and so these questions actually have shaped my entry into this field. And I think the ethnography in this field has played a significant part of my research, has shaped the kind of questions that I ask. And I'll end by saying one last thing. Over the course of last 15, 18 years, I have done a fair bit of ethnography, and I was always asked what brought me to this field by my Dalit interlocutors in Lucknow, Kanpur, Etawah, Agra, Allahabad, Jhansi. I mean, there's Eta. So sometimes they will say, okay, you are not a Brahmin, you are upper caste. And sometimes they will assume that Rawat is, sometimes they wonder that I'm a Parsi, because there are a lot of Rawats in UP who are Parsis. And so, so those are, kind of questions that brought me into this field. And so I found ethnography as a very important medium in thinking about these questions. So let me kind of say a couple of things and then I'll stop here. The other thing I want to say is that you said you want to have a conversation on caste. And I think what is profoundly disturbing about when we think about the conversation of caste is that much of anthropology and history and much of the work that has been done, most of the work has been done on Dalit society or Dalit caste and history. But you find very few histories of caste among Brahmins. We find, very few anthropological and sociological studies of Brahmins, at least in UP, very few. And also of Thakurs. You will find a lot on lower caste. You'll find a lot on Dalits. But when we think of the history of caste, so what is, coming back to the question of privilege, I think it is the privilege of South Asian historiography that they only write about Dalit issues and lower caste issues. The caste ethnographies of Brahmins, at least in northern India, are very few and far in between, and we need more. And I think that is an important question because as Vineet and Prashant have pointed out, I think the question of Mohalla is very important. The question of Mohalla is very important because I think that if you grow up in rural India, you are shaped by this ideological formulation of Mohalla in which we live. So there's a Brahmin Mohalla, there is a Caste, there's a Thakur Mohalla, and there is a Dalit Mohalla. I don't see that discussed in histories of caste. There are very few books that talk about those things. We always get caught in the notions of purity and pollution. Purity and pollution overtakes the discussion about what is happening in the mohallas. Why are there different mohallas? And I think that's where the question of privilege comes in. That it is because of our privilege that we don't have to write the histories of Brahmin and Thakurs. We need to only write the histories of lower caste. There's a lot of histories of Yadavas. There's a lot of ethnographies of untouchables, or Dalits, but nothing on Brahmins. And so I think the question of privilege to me is very important. And I'll say the last thing and then I'll stop. During the second Dalit Studies conference in Delhi, Isabel Wilkerson, who's just written a book on caste, came and wanted to talk about this issue at Delhi in Dalit Studies conference. And I think here also in the US, the question of privilege, suburban areas in the US, they're racially segregated. They're spatially and racially segregated. The question, so it's not just India, actually it's spread over in different ways. The way privilege plays a role here. So let me stop here, and some of these issues will come up in the question and answer session. And so thank you very much, Suraj.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ram. I think, and I think I've gathered so many notes of all four of you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put out question to each of you, and I will invite you to briefly answer. So what will happen is because also on YouTube, people are asking questions. So I'm going to take that as well. So to begin with, why don't I begin with you, Ram, as an order, and then we can go. So what you pointed out is quite interesting. So what I want to perhaps ask to you is, as a scholar who studies caste, and of course there is a scant attention paid to how caste operates, especially the intra-caste divisions among Rajputs, right? Because of course class as well plays a role. The reason I am invested in this is because can we recover a loving, kind, compassionate Rajput as opposed to someone who is always sporting a sword, having a very aggressive image, a very almost a threatening presentation? If that is possible, how do we go about it? I ask this question because the young Rajput kids, Gen Z, millennial, they would like to participate in some of the anti-caste movement activities, but also they would like to imagine a new, future or history. So it's also like my questions, whatever I will ask, is directed to kind of taking the younger generation into context.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. How can we create a more inclusive notions around caste? And I think the best way to do is do more research, and that's to me there are very few ethnographies and sociological studies of Thakurs and Kshatriyas, except what we have available from the religious studies background, religious history background. And I think we have to recover and bring those issues into. And I also remember, Suraj, this is a more recent articulation of even the idea of Ram, and then you of course mentioned Buddha. This is a much more recent articulation of and a recent change that is happening in India, and so I think we need to recognize that the historical context here is very important. It's a recent phenomena. At the same time, I think recovering this, I don't know how you go about recovering this, because at the end, I think we may have to tell new stories. But then the problem we face, I mean, I think there's a larger issue at stake, Suraj, which I don't know how to articulate this, but maybe lay it out right there. I think we're stuck in trying to be inclusive here, and at the same time we're stuck with the reality that Hindu religious institutions, they have never refuted the ideology of untouchability in the religion. So if you don't do that, if you don't refute the ideology and the practice and the cultural inheritance around untouchability in your religion, how do you go about changing it? So, if you look at Christianity, there's an effort to, for example, right now, the idea that there should be gay and lesbian priests in church is a phenomenon. So if you can make that change possible in the level of religion, then it's easier to make it political. And I think that's where I think in India, we write all these histories, but we have to recognize that unless there is a recognition by religious institutions of disowning untouchability, which I don't know whether that's going to happen, until we can do that, you are going to face the same kind of questions that, Khushi mentioned or I encountered. Why do you have to deal with these issues? Why do we need to talk about these issues? As Vineet and Prashant mentioned, we don't need this is different. This is not part of a religious thing. I think there's a big religious cultural question that we have to recognize that we have not actually. And I think Nehru and Gandhi, they could have dealt with it, but I think the biggest failure, I think, of Indian democracy is its failure to, or Indian leaders, is their failure to create a conversation on the question that we, not create, but I think Gandhi did try to create a conversation on this question. And Ambedkar tried to do that, same thing. But I think Hindu religious leaders failed to go forward and discuss this and actually say that untouchability, we should not. So that's the problem.
That's right.
That's the problem. That's a cultural problem and a political problem and a problem at all levels. So that's where, so to me, that would be my counter question to you. How do we deal with that? Okay.
I think what I'll do is I'll take this question to Vineet, and Vineet, since you grew up with your own biography, which is quite striking and also in a way normal for you to not think about very much what Ram, taking cue from Ram's kind of story as well. What we need to do is to start a conversation amongst, let's say, Rajput a family, but also younger generation, to self-introspect, right? And self-introspect for your own welfare, not for a charitable, So what has to do that, right? And so that could happen, which really happened with you is under or miseducation of your own story. The Rajput stories I know of were pretty much, in a way, the stories that sometimes contradict with the Brahminical notion. I always think what superior one is when you are still inferior to someone who is higher than you, right? Which means there is still a Brahmin touting down on you. And what Ram said is what on our panel on Brahmins against Brahminism, Satish Deshpande, Anu Rao, and S. Anand, they were there. And they were actually, Ram, they took out, they were saying the Brahmins need to, get rid of Hinduism, or there needs to be massive change to that, And so that was a really kind of a point where people were unhappy about. How would you, Vineet, as a scholar, would tell or think through with the younger generation of Rajput community?
Thanks, Suraj. I grew up in the 90s. And like I was saying, there's an RSS background where, RSS is trying to sort of re-emasculate the Indian society. So it's, you kind of think of RSS as a Brahmin project, but it's kind of trying to merge the Brahmins and the Rajputs together and basically saying we've been emasculated too long. So let's re-emasculate the society. So in a way that I think it never played that way, probably in a local context it might, but in a way it's never played in my mind that, Rajputs are in some ways inferior to the Brahmins, because throughout the 90s, there was this assertion about, Hindu, whatever, need to be masculinized and all of that. So, so if at all, there's something, I think it's kind of happening the other way around now, where, the Brahmins have to become more like Kshatriyas, and RSS does this project actually really well. Just for instance, which I remember still, I'm very ashamed of it, but I remember it very clearly. I was 5, 6, 7 years old, and it was during the Ayodhya movement. And I remember, I used to be one of those, who recites poems for school, and it was an RSS school. And we went on a sort of a sort of competition, and there was the chief minister of the state on the dais, and I was sort of saying this poem in a very, virus kind of a thing, which is basically about killing Muslims. That, we've all been emasculated, and the Hindus, whatever, civilization has been emasculated. So there's a need to sort of kill all Muslims and that sort of stuff. Obviously, I didn't know the meaning of any of that. And later you reflect on this. So in my mind, there's never sense of being a sense of inferiority. In fact, it's kind of been the other way around. These Brahmins have, that's kind of the narrative that is being fed. These Brahmins have led us, whatever, and they need to sort of emasculate. So there's a bit of that, I think. In terms of, I think what you initially asked, is there anything redemptive in Rajput identity? I don't think so. I mean, there could be anything redemptive if there was anything good about it. I don't think there's anything good about it. It's premised on this notion of the other, which is whatever. And, like the initial clip that you played. So what is what makes a Rajput different? I mean, this sort of very masculine thing. If you're not masculine, then you're not Rajput. So there is nothing redemptive in that identity. So it's like, it's like, so because, you work on race, you kind of think, oh, is there a good one? Can you have a good white identity? Not really, because without sort of, it's kind of that. So I don't think there's anything redemptive that, that the Rajput kids, they have to go out of the Rajput identity. They have to sort of, disown it. Yeah.
Thank you. Khushi, so this is like a very much like a male domain, right? Especially when it comes to Rajput, Kshatrani, then again is a convoluted kind of character, and you would like it or not, you are still a Kshatrani, right? And then your kind of title kind of follows with you, but it's so fake, doesn't make sense. Like when you arrived in US, nobody would like, so what? Stand in line, brown woman, and get your things done, right? So subordinate status, especially when you collide with a other supremacist regime. And so when you self-reflect, Khushi, growing up in your own family, other male members, could you tell us a bit about your own upbringing in the sense of, were you taught to develop more compassion to non-Rajputs, lower, quote unquote, lower caste or Dalits in that case? Or were you also trained if you had to fall romantically in relationship with someone? Would had to be, for example, I mean, of course, your family must be something else, but let's say you happen to fall in love with a Dalit. How would it play in part? Because people like Kangana Ranawat, for example, or other kind of Thakur, Rajput kind of science who represent is we don't know that, right? So can you tell us about your own female experiences of Kshatrani?
So actually, see, as you rightly said, that identity never leaves you. Okay, like you're told, this thing is repeated often. The idea of a Rajput woman is also, there's a difference of how valor is associated, right? Like for a man, is going winning war. For a woman, it's I'll go do Johar. So, the whole idea of how it plays on the body of a woman is only very different. The fact that you asked me about, caste and marriage and not any of the male panelists also says how that question is also, it also piques your interest when a woman enters the scene. Because if you ask me, it applies to the Rajput men also. I have male members, younger boys in my family who've been trained from very early on and told that do whatever you want to do, marry a good Rajput girl. Okay, so that thing is always there because eventually it's about the woman, and procreation and the purity of the blood. If you, of course, I've been made very aware at a very early age about, the whole idea of being the good Rajput girl in the sense of the marriage aspect of it. Intercaste marriages are not taken well within my community. Within my family, now again, that is something which is a very tricky space because I haven't grown up in a joint family. I've grown up in a nuclear family, which changes the entire dynamic of that conversation. That is also the reason why probably I can talk about caste the way I talk about it, because this nuclear unit has again had a class which has been different from the class of the rest of the family. So our economic realities have been fairly different if I compare it to my extended family. But yes, marriage is something, to cut the long answer short, yes, I've been trained to think, till say I was in college, of course, I was like, first year college, I was like, no, you can't fall in love with anyone who's from another caste. It won't be taken well. Okay. Which is the usual thought process. What is interesting though is, and, I like, you didn't ask me this, but I would go back to what you asked Professor Rawat and what, asked Vineet about the idea of a Rajput, and the idea of for the younger generation, and as you were asking that question, I was thinking what formulated my idea. And one thing that struck me, see, history is also mostly history of men, right? And that is a part of my work also when I study IR. My constant woe is history is written by men for men. And then I remember that my mother, because she comes from Jaisalmer and, she comes from a fairly privileged family. And I remember my mother telling me stories about her grandmother, great-grandmother, and she was like, my great-great-grandmother, she would, she breastfed this child who was from another caste, a lower caste, and mother had passed away and she had her own son. She was still lactating. So she breastfed both of them together. And I heard it and I was like, and I was fairly amused to think of it, because this is not something which is chronicle. This is not something that is spoken about. This is a story of compassion, which my mother tells me as a bedtime story, or just, we are having our own mother-daughter moments. And it brings me to the first thing that you said about Meera. Remember? The woman in that Rajput identity. And I was like, where are these stories? Because there are enough of these stories which are in oral history, just of stories which are not bound by this very masculine notion of what is, a Kshatriya and what is a Rajput. So yeah, I think, I hope I answered your question. Did you ask me something else?
No, you did. No. So the question was not only about marriage. What it was trying to say is the protection of a Rajput woman, right? So that kind of upbringing, right? I mean.
No, of course, Suraj, like the very idea that I went to a very good school, but a lot that happened when I look back in that school was based around the idea of making me that ideal woman, which is closest to the stereotype of a Rajput woman in that upper society.
Right.
Right. The whole idea of situating that honor in the body of a woman, and that's very interesting then when you bring in the notion of Kshatrani, okay, because you're supposed to be very strong and you're supposed to be very all of that. But only to that extent that you don't, the idea of purity and impurity becomes important. See, because purity and impurity is also not necessarily always in terms of oppression and oppressor, right? It's also within the caste on how you're controlling the bodies of women and of anyone else who's not fitting that script.
Right.
So I hope I answer.
Yeah, sure. And we'll come to the second round kind of. Prashant, very briefly, if you could just taking the cue from this, your own family background has a story. What I would be kind of, it's more of an academic question, but also let's try to derive more from your own personal experiences as well, like how caste kind of changes. For example, Khushi, you from Rajasthan, and they are from Himachal. And if you go to South India, the Tamilians will say we don't have Rajputs here. It's a North Indian problem. And when I made this, like some Tamilian friends and comrades had said that, oh, why are you privileging North Indians? And I think that's a very interesting kind of kind of inquiry into this story of how the North Indian base becomes. We hardly have anything or much of the thing, Prashant, that we can really derive as an inspiration to be emulated. And whoever became anti-caste are probably not owned by Rajputs only up to the extent of Hinduizing them, right? Buddha is still Hinduized. Guru Nanak is still Hinduized. Is there a space for Rajputs to own them as our ancestors, on whose path we can perhaps follow? than simply becoming Hindu?
Sorry. So I was like, listening to what the co-panelists were saying. It's really fascinating. Uh, but since my training has been more academic in this issue, and I've studied caste for a long period of time. Uh, so I would like to answer your question, academically, and maybe bring in some personal narratives in between. Uh, like Professor Rawat was talking about the three of us being, from the hills and, and otherized as Pahadis by our, by the people we met while studying in Delhi. Uh, but it would have been like Khushi is from Rajasthan, fairly feudal state. It would have been even more interesting if we had more, Kshatriyas from other areas of India. Um, but when you situate the whole debate in the hills of India, one has to understand and locate the debate, contextualize it in its historicity. For instance, in Himachal, like the way caste pans out in rest of India is not merely ritually; it also pans out in terms of its economics. So land there becomes a central question: who controls land, who is the owner of land? And in most of like if you're aware, in Punjab, the scheduled castes were not even allowed to own land till 1962, so many years after independence, and that has created an incidence of landlessness amongst the Dalit community in Punjab. And on the contrary, in Himachal, we do not see a much of a difference between, ownership of land amongst the Rajput community and the non-Rajput community. Uh, though the Rajput community might have access to more land, but it is not that the scheduled caste community in Himachal Pradesh does not own land. So one, we look at the debate in terms of whether the land reforms, how they were implemented, and were they successful in our state? Yes, they were very successful. There was a government program of giving land to the landlessness. It was called the Rathore program, whereby anybody who was landless could apply for land, and they did get land. So there was equalization of access. Another thing was that in the hills, there is a lot of cooperation between various castes in terms of various economic tasks related to land. It's merely, because of the lack of people, in comparison to the plains of India. So less people living in a village, they have to cooperate with one another. And so we have instances of the Rajputs carrying the carcasses of dead animals, flaying dead animals, working together. While ritual purity and pollution does play out extensively, but at the same time, it's like many academics have written about it, that that the whole caste system plays out in terms of its convenience. So like when it is convenient to you, you refer to your caste, and when it is inconvenient to you, it's all right. The Dalit community can come and build my house, it's fine. Like as soon as they can move around the whole house, jump up and down, sleep there till the time they're constructing my house. But at the moment my house is constructed, I perform puja, throw Ganga Jal here and there, and suddenly it's pure. The Dalit community can grow all the food for everybody in this country, and everybody can eat it, and it's all right. So like when Professor Rawat was talking about the whole two well system in his village, I found it very fascinating, because I've spoken about this to some upper caste people, is that that one should understand that the groundwater is the same. The groundwater is touching each other. So just merely by digging up, symbolizing one well as a upper caste well and the other well as a lower caste well, does not change the fact that that the water which is underground, touches each other. So if one water is ritually defiled, the other automatically becomes defiled. So my relationship with caste is more contextualized with rationality, because we have been methodologically taught to be rational, use logic. So we see caste differently and from a different lens altogether. And this is what we are teaching our students, and this is what we discuss with each other, and this is what we talk to other people around us at all points of time. So when I was pursuing this research, I also had the privilege of meeting people from various age groups. So since much of the history of caste in my region is oral, and I was very interested in actually documenting it, because there are certain people who might not be there to tell us how caste existed at one point of time. So we'll not have this whole comparative contextualization of how it was and how it was operationalized and how it changed over time. So I was talking to some of my cousins and one of my father's relatives who is now 80 plus, and his son who is almost 55. So their responses to the caste question were very interesting. My father's relative, who was older, he was of the opinion that the caste system structured social life in the village, and the way it was operationalized during his time was a better way of life. And he berated his son for destroying that social structure. And the son was of the opinion that that the father lived in a different time altogether, and that time was more localized without the secular institutions percolating. And now it is more like that calling anybody with a caste name is an offense. So the younger generation is aware of it, and the younger generation is also much more broad-minded in that way. And another instance that my cousin gave was that when you're talking about ritual purity and pollution, like now most of the people who are in government services and who are controlling the irrigation department, and they open the water every day from the pipes, are from the scheduled caste community. So so then he asked his father, like that would you stop drinking that water also, and you will still want to go and get water from the river or the local place wherever you used to get water. And so the modernization of life and has also changed the manner in which we look at caste. And so that is how I look at the whole question of caste per se. Yeah.
I think Prashant, you in a way have answered what my next question, final kind of a closing remark was, and this is a question for everybody, and and I also have taken kind of summary from our YouTube chat as well, where the question Preeti Kohli puts that there is a lot of silence around that, and how do we really find a way? So one of the things is, so Ram, why don't you begin? My question is, can Rajputs be anti-caste or anti-caste activists or anti-caste individuals? If yes, how do they go about it? Very briefly. You are mute.
I think I'm one to start with as an anti-caste activist. And I've done this for last. I think to me the biggest question is an ethical question here. Ethical question about religion, the kind of questions you asked. And I think to me, in my own work also, I think it's important to recognize Nanak and the whole idea of Satnam, that and the Raidas and a number of this what Achyutanandan Dalit activist called a Sant Mat religion around, Raidas, Kabir, and Nanak, are important ways of thinking about questions of politics and religiosity. And to me, I think it's very important to step outside. I don't think it's, therefore, to kind of reframe it, I don't think I can be a Rajput and yet be an anti-caste activist. To me, that doesn't work. I can't. And I think because I think, and that's the problem, as I said, in Hinduism, that you have to rethink how we do Hinduism. You can't, if you don't want to reject it, you have to actually address the question of, and recognize that we have to either theologically disrecognize this religion and engage with people, and that's the job. I can't do that. None of us here can do that because we're not, and the tragedy is only the religious people who are the priests can do that, but they will never do that because they are so narrowly educated. And so that's a problem, and I think, so as a citizen of India, one can be an anti-caste activist and one has to step outside. Now, of course, the RSS saying the same thing, you can give up your caste and yet be Hindu. So I'm saying it's not just caste, but also you have to think about what kind of, the question of Hinduism more important here. Caste is less central to me. I think to me, the question of Hindu religion is far more important here. Caste is just an extension of that. So those are my 2 cents, as it were.
That's quite interesting. Khushi, would you agree with what Ram has said, especially when it comes to his proposition, and also a question of Subi has also asked you a question, and you can of course see in the chat one of the questions she says is, I have a question for Khushi. When she talked about patriarchy and argued that she will not deny that there are no patriarchy among Dalits, my question is why upper caste feminists are unable to define about the patriarchy without discussing Dalit patriarchy. If all men are patriarchal, then what about caste hierarchy? So what she's trying to, probably there is a pushback in a way to, why do you always, kind of when you define that? So I guess you can take the way you want, but the question is, would you approve of Ram's prescription to it being a Hindu, and then if you have to work through it, how would you go about it? You're mute, yeah.
Okay, first, to address the question I got in the chat, I'm sorry if it came across that way, that, I can't talk about patriarchy without addressing Dalit patriarchy. That's not what I meant. I don't absolve any man of patriarchy. That is my position as a feminist. But of course, caste hierarchy is something which has to be, it's not that simple. And yeah, I'm sorry if it came across as that way. You asked me, do I agree with what Professor Rawat said about his prescription? Suraj, I think it's a fairly more complicated question, especially for someone like me who is also situated, in JNU, in the middle of a certain political scenario, where the anti-secular, anti-democratic forces are coming after you one after another, even from a privileged place. Because JNU is also privileged. So for me, if you ask me that, is the question not about caste, but about Hinduism? I don't think I can answer that as an upper caste person. What is my positionality there? Because I haven't had to, lose anything because of my caste identity. I've only earned because of it. So I morally don't feel equipped, I ethically don't feel equipped to say that, in my limited knowledge of things. The question about Hinduism, though I do agree with Professor Rawat over there to an extent, because not let me frame it well, because my own thoughts are slightly scattered here, but I also don't think that the pushback to Hindutva as this establishment is painting it, because it's not only anti-Dalit, it's also anti-Muslim, it's anti anyone who speaks against the establishment. So we also have to be very conscious that there are multiple struggles which are happening around the same time over here. So there, I think definitely the idea of Hinduism needs to be redefined, because if you ask me in terms of a solution that, that if my solution to everything that we are talking about, this casteist, Brahminical state, is that let go of Hinduism, Hinduism is bad, and then you think I can get the majority of the electorate of this country to agree with me and vote this government out, that is not happening. I don't have that kind of a faith. So that kind of reformation, I do think, is important, because we also don't address that question. No, we are so bound in that idea of Ambedkar and Nehru's India that we don't agree with that. Deep down, we are, this Hindutva is not a product of this government. This government is a product of that Hindutva which has been lying around for so long. So in that sense, I do agree with what he says.
Thank you. Vineet, very quickly, I mean, Kunal Sahadev had sent a question, as well as Kabilan. I mean, it's kind of questions about, how the brown identity exploits Black oppression to benefit, especially in the Western metropolis, right? And there's a kind of a little bit investment. So you can take that, but also help us if one has to be anti-caste Kshatriya or Rajput.
I mean, I'll quickly answer that with saying that I have no moral compunctions in fully and emphatically agreeing with whatever Ram said. I fully take, my good friend Prashant's point about, secularization, democratization, helping it, but I'm not that convinced. If I could very quickly give an anecdote, my grandmother and my grandfather at their time, and it's that Pahari identity, you live up in the hills. We used to have these, not marriages, but a lot of people used to elope. My grandmother and my grandfather never married because it was, I think, the third woman that my grandfather hadn't eloped with, and probably the third man that my grandmother had eloped with. And my grandfather, and like when they talked to each other, they would speak to each other with two, and take each other's names. But as my father got educated and whatever, as it came to my parents' generation, and they were very Sanskritized in a way, because they are trying to identify themselves with the modern Indian, which is actually much more patriarchal. My mother ended up probably suffering patriarchy much more than my grandmother did. So this is anecdotal, but the idea is that secularization and democratization does not necessarily, it might make you modern, but it makes you modern in a very Kamna Ranaut kind of sense that, you believe that everything is equal and therefore merit only sustains and all of that. And as Khushi was saying, that this modernization, secularization has led us to Hindutva and our whatever politics, all our engineers, we produce so many engineers and most of them elect Narendra Modi. So the point being that, it's not a one-way process, I kind of think. And that's not necessarily always the answer. On the brown identity exploiting Black identity, we can go whole day, but
that's right.
It definitely does, yeah.
Very, very. I'm getting chats, but people, I'll say at the end. But finally, Prashant, you have just take a minute and tell us if one has to become an anti-caste, and for the younger generation, especially from the Rajput community, what should they do?
It's it would be fair to say that that one needs to reflect and be critical about what is and what ought to be. Locate the debate also in terms of fairness. Are we fair? Can we be fair? And because we are trying to as Vineet has just pointed out that that secularization and democratization does not necessarily lead the way. It is correct to some extent, but at the same time, it is certainly demonstrating some changes. When in terms of access to credit and in terms of access to capital, access to land, and access to education, and basically climbing up in terms of social mobility and social capital, So, we are seeing multiple changes. The place that I'm situated in right now, we have during this lockdown, there was much construction work going on in the village here, and but there were no laborers because everybody had migrated. So there is this whole village is upper caste Rajput village, um, with only one Brahmin, and the rest are all upper caste Rajput families. And the only contractor that was available here during that time was a scheduled caste contractor from the nearby village. And everybody was after him to have their works finished. So it's his position, economically, also demarcates the manner in which his political aspirations are articulated. Um, so I believe that one, if one has to be anti-caste, one certainly needs to place the debate in terms of, like, what ought to be. And so the moral ethical question here becomes philosophical, in that sense, like, uh, um, that that we are basically all human beings, and one should respect each other as a human being, and have human dignity. And the same goes for when Khushi is talking about feminism, and, like, there was a question on Dalit patriarchy, and patriarchy among the Dalit community. So nobody's condoning patriarchy amongst the Dalits or amongst the upper caste, or feminism in all the communities. So we are all fighting for a world which is just and fair. And I would just like to
Right.
that's my sense of it.
This was excellent, guys. I've got like chats personally saying there were at least 3 Thakurs who sent me private. I guess they don't want me to identify them. Who said they approve of Ram's message on and one of them identifies as an atheist Thakur. So I guess there is the way people are probably looking at this aspect of Hinduism and the anecdote to it. This was really an enriching discussion. Part
I
of
think,
it.
Suraj,
Yeah, Ram.
just to add to what, I'll just say a couple of things here. I think the big difference, I think, is that the priests of Hindu religion are not educated. They don't have any liberal arts education the way let's say the priests here have in the Christian priests. You can talk to them about various things. Whereas the priests in India, in Hinduism, I think, so my point is that I think during independence and since independence, we missed the bus, as it were, where the priest should also been forced to get a degree in a liberal arts college before they can become a priest of temples and religion. Otherwise, so now what we have are 2 different worlds. And I think, coming back to what people are saying, I think JNU has finally been integrated into India. That it was, it was outside of it for last 50 years because of the Congress, and again, because of privilege.
That's right, absolutely.
So I think those are the kind of questions we have to think. So those are my last two cents.
No, indeed. And also on JNU, I have also my Dalit friends and Adivasi friends who talk about privilege. And I say, you being at JNU itself is a big privilege. And I think that self-reflection really doesn't kind of take place as adequately as Gopal Guru would expect or argue. And I think this focus especially is also hoping that many other Thakur or Rajputs who joined this conversation and who will eventually see is there is a space for you to perhaps think and leave that suffocating space of trying to reproduce your own hegemony wherever you go. You don't have to. You can participate as patiently as you can and become someone who someone can aspire to. Right now we have a very wrong aspirations of Thakurs. It becomes Aditya Best who goes by Adityanath, as well as there are very unsavory examples of Rajput representation, which I don't think we need for next generation to emulate. We really need educated people like our panelists today who are willing to put themselves on a defensive, but also on a question of self-reflection. And I think self-reflection is part of our larger humanities project that we would like to do. Many thanks to our excellent panelists. I am very enriched. And also thank you to many people who have joined online, people who are sending me private messages. For and you can feel free to reach out to the panelists, whoever feel like getting more talk about this. I guess there is a space that Thakur would like to create about anti-caste Thakurs or anti-caste Rajputs. I guess there is a space for a group like that to exist, where Thakurs or Rajputs can talk amongst themselves, think about, because you are not alone. Many people like you might exist, and I think, why should it always be anti-caste Dalits? There can be anti-caste Brahmins, anti-caste Thakurs, and I think that's the humanitarian space we would like to offer. And I take Ram's point, and I think everybody, especially in the book of mine, also criticized a Brahmin cannot be anti-Brahminism. He needs to live his Brahmin identity or of some sort. But I think there are ways we can navigate and negotiate that. This was a very soulful conversation for me. I really wish to continue this. Hopefully, in a short time, maybe we'll have part 2, a redux and remix of what we are discussing today. So immensely grateful to you, Khushi, Vineet, Prashant, and Ram. I am grateful, and I'm sure the audience celebrates you for your work as well. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Suresh, for hosting this.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. We'll talk again.
We'll talk. Stay strong.